like I said before, it's kind of preambled by the fact that the religious leaders are onto Stephen, and they are not liking the fact that he is talking against the temple and against Moses and the law, which wasn't really a true accusation. It was a false accusation, but that's what they were going for. And Stephen has this amazing way of starting, because he says, "Brothers and sisters, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham." God of glory. And he ends by looking up to heaven and seeing the glory of God. So God of glory is where it starts, and glory of God is where it ends. Those are the two brackets to this time where he is speaking to the religious leaders. And for the full duration, from the one bracket to the next, his face is shining like an angel. The glory of God represented in and through his life. And, Moses asked God at one point to show him his glory. That was Moses' request. And God says to him, "I will let my goodness pass by you, and I will proclaim my name." So that's God's answer to show me your glory. If you're wondering what glory is, it's God's character, it's his goodness, and it's his name. All of who he is his glory. And so that actually happens, and when he proclaims his name to Moses, it speaks about him being compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love, faithful, forgiving, all these amazing characteristics of God. But the glory of God is what Stephen was focusing on, and he starts with this God of glory, and he ends with the glory of God. And in between, all he's doing is looking at those very things that gives him a good understanding of just how amazing this glorious God is. So when you read it at first, you kind of feel like you're just sitting in a history lesson. And it's quite factual, and then this happened and that happened. But actually what he's doing is he's looking at those amazing realities of God that gives him an understanding of the fact that he's talking about this God of glory. His focus is the glory of God, and it comes through a realization that God is gracious, he's a God of promise, he's a God of love, and he's a God of eternity. And when we focus on the glory of God, we get to live in the fullness of his grace. And we get to live in the security of his promises. And we get to live with an absolute assurance of the fact that he is steadfast in his love for us. And it's not just what we have now, it's something that will last for all eternity. So when you realize there's the glory of God, we get to live in the fullness of his grace, the security of his promise, the assurance of his steadfast love, and it's for now and for all eternity. So we're going to look this morning at the glory of God, the fact that he's a God of grace, he's a God of promise, he's a God of love, and he's a God of eternity. So God of grace, let's start with that. He says that the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. Now this is Stephen's way of saying the gospel starts with Abraham. Because these men that he's talking to was just focusing on Moses. They were just focusing on the law, they were focusing on the temple, and they knew very well where it all started, but their focus wasn't there. And so Abraham, at this point in time that Stephen's referring to, was actually Abram. His name was Abram, not Abraham. And God appears to him in Mesopotamia. So what we get from that is he was a pagan man. He was a moon worshiper. the moon god Nana. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm picturing like hardy-dars in the background while he's worshiping the moon. And we lose sight of the fact that this is Abraham. He worshipped the moon. He had no interest in God. Didn't know God existed. He wasn't even a Jew then. He was still a Gentile before God met him. And this God of glory comes to bless Abram in Mesopotamia. I mean, he's quite clear there is before he lived in Haran. You know why Stephen's saying that? Is because it was out of obedience that Abram moved to Haran. Because God said, you must leave your country. God says, before he lived there, God appeared to him. Not after he was obedient, not after he showed some form of godliness did God appear to him. Before any of it happened, he appeared. So the blessing of God didn't come upon a Mosaic law, didn't come upon the temple, didn't even come upon a Jewish nationality. It came upon this pagan moon worshipper. Kind of throws your circuitry just a little. And he's doing the work. You know, like as you read it, you see there's a divine direction taking place. I mean, it uses phrases like God appeared, then God said, God promised, God sent, God spoke. Abraham's doing nothing. Then he gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision, it says in verse 8. And Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him 8 days after his birth. Later, Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob became the father of the 12 patriarchs. So when we realize that there was a covenant that God actually cut with Abraham while he was still Abram, and this took place while Abram was sleeping. He wasn't actually all there. He wasn't present in this covenant-making reality. He was asleep. And what happens in this covenant-making reality is they would walk a figure 8, which was like two parties entering into a covenant. They would walk a figure 8, which basically meant it would last forever. It's the sign of infinity, or it's not coming to an end. This covenant is forever. And there would be an animal sacrifice on either side that they would walk around. And they would basically say, if I break this covenant, I'm entering into covenant with you. If I break this covenant, may what's happened to this animal happen to me. That was kind of like the walk. But when this covenant happens with Abraham, the scripture talks about a smoking pot and a flaming torch. That was Jesus, represented as fully God and fully man, cutting that covenant on our behalf, because he is the mediator of this covenant. And you know what he would be saying as far as the terms of that covenant is? If I break this covenant, may what's happened to this animal happen to me. But if you break this covenant, may what's happened to this animal happen to me. And Abraham sleeping. So Jesus takes the fullness of that covenantal reality upon himself and brings Abraham into this brand new identity. He gets given a new identity. He's now a child of God, which is why God changes his name. He takes the H out of his name, Yahweh, which in the original vernacular is YHWH, and he puts it into Abram's name, Abraham. And Sarai becomes Sarah. He puts his H into their name. All of it's happening without Abraham even being awake. And while he's in Mesopotamia, the pagan land, God goes there, not at the temple. See, the grace of God. And then this thing of circumcision follows, which was a sign of a cutting away of the flesh. It's to signify coming into this relationship has got nothing to do with your efforts. And so this message of coming into a right standing with God, being in a relationship with God, was something that God orchestrated and God did and God put into effect before there was even a hint of godliness, a hint of response. He hadn't yet obeyed God. He hadn't yet done it. All he did was he believed God's promises and he believed what God said. And as a result of his belief, it was credited to him as righteousness, Scripture tells us. So you come into this place of right standing, being a child of God, only because you have faith, only because you believe what God's done on your behalf. This mediation of a covenant that happened before we were even born. See, that's grace. And Stephen's saying, can we just take a moment to go back to Abraham, because you guys are so fixated on Moses. You need to understand that where this started shows us that our God is a God of grace. It's no wonder he was shining like an angel. And this message of righteousness by faith had to be preserved. It had to be handed down to the generations. So it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs. So it was like, we're going to hand it down. But don't lose the message. Don't lose what this is about. And as we might know, that did in fact happen. They lost it. Then in Acts 7, from verse 9 to 15, he starts talking about Joseph. And the only thing I want to mention is that he refers to the word Egypt 6 times within 7 verses. Why? Because 7 is the number of perfection. 6 is the number of imperfection. And Egypt was a place of darkness. And God met Joseph in Egypt. He didn't say, hey, Joseph, you can make it out of here. Come back to the promised land. Come back to Canaan. Come back to where I am. Then we can maybe talk. No, he went there. He went to Egypt. He's a God of promise. It says he gave him no inheritance here, not even a foot of ground, but God promised him that he and his descendants after him would possess the land, even though at that time Abraham had no child. Do you know that Abraham was landless? Didn't own land. Not even a foot of ground. So what was that promise about? I mean, when Sarah died, he had to buy a burial plot for her. He didn't have land. He couldn't even bury his wife. So God gives him a new identity, but he doesn't give him land. And why is this a point? Why is Stephen putting this to the crowd, the audience, and it being put in Scripture for us to know? Is that we would understand there's a distinction between the blessing of redemption and the blessing of reward. There's a promise of redemption and there's a promise of reward. So when God said to Abraham, I will give you land, it didn't happen while he was alive. But he was a child of God. So he was given the promise of redemption. He was given the blessing of salvation. He was given the blessing of being a child of God, but it was totally distinct from any form of inheritance or reward. And Stephen's making that very clear, that we understand there's 2 promises at play here. And the inheritance that God had for Abraham was something that he would lay hold of in the life after death. This is not a temporal inheritance that some of us could potentially hope for. When that comes through. This is a much richer, much fuller inheritance. Not temporal, eternal. That's why in Hebrews 11 it says of Abraham, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So the gospel doesn't promise earthly riches. doesn't promise a cushy life. That's the prosperity gospel, which is a false gospel. In fact, it's not a gospel. So if you're reading or listening to people that tell you that, stop listening to them. Because it's not what God has promised. He has promised us an identity. He has promised us a new life. He makes Abram and Abraham. But when he promises inheritance, some of that could be within this life. But don't bank on it. We're looking ahead. We're looking on the other side, like Abraham looked to that future. So the promise of resurrection life is obtained by faith. The promise of reward is obtained by the life that we live in God, and as He leads us and as we respond to Him and live by faith and live in obedience and live in the calling that He gives us. The first one's guaranteed, the second one's not. But they do come as two promises because He's a God of promise. Then it says in verse 17, as the time drew near for God to fulfill His promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. Now there it proves it, because at that point Abraham was dead. Or was he? No, he wasn't dead. He was alive in an eternal context. And so God was fulfilling that promise to him, but at a time where he was not living on this earth anymore. And the fact that he was fulfilling the promise at the time that he said he would, and how he said he would, means that he's not just a promise maker, he's a promise keeper. He's a faithful, steadfast covenant keeper. And history shows it, which is what Stephen's doing here. Because he's saying, and then God did this, and then God said that, and then it happened, and then it went like this, and then it went like that, and it was 400 years. And he's giving all these details because that's exactly what God does. He's faithful to his promise, and he looks after his promise by a divine providence. He makes sure everything falls into place in the smallest detail, but with an eye of the big picture. It's amazing how we don't have that big picture, so we struggle sometimes when things don't go our way. But just remember, when you're looking to the God of glory, he's a God of promise, and he is over all of that, and he is working for our eternal good. So even though it might not look like it's panning out in the temporal space, as far as eternity is concerned, he is turning all things for good, and he is working through all of those details. You know, we have just bought a house. Yes, one who... It was the one thing that we kind of felt like we really want to put our roots down in this town because God has put us here. And with that, we realized, okay, quite a stretch from where we came from, market-wise, and what we got for the house that we sold. This is not going to work. It would have to be God speaking in a way that is undoubted him. And like now we can, with faith, trust that he's going to provide for it, and we're taking those steps. But you know how it happened was that we planted this church on the basis of a promise that we feel God gave us in Ezekiel 17. And from that moment, God has used the number 17 to speak to me in ways that's just been incredible. Keeps coming up. So we started, our first service was on the 17th of February. It happened at 17 Barry Road. I preached from John 17. There was another 17. I can't even remember. And so 17. Then when we were given the opportunity to lay hold of this new property and what that translates to as far as a cost per rand square meter was 267 rand per square meter. And now all of a sudden 267 is a new number. And it's like hovering, and God's using it. And so when this property came our way via email, there was an indication of the number of the house. Guess what number it was? 17. And as I went further down, I saw the square meterage of the house was 267. You see, so like God, He can, 35 years ago, in 1986, when Antoinette was in matric and I was only in standard 4, respect. Taitani. He would know that 35 years down the line, we would be planning a church on the promise of Ezekiel 17 and how He would use that number 17, that this house would be number 17, that an architect would be sitting down and designing a house and that it would come to 267 square meters, and that number would have significance for me, that there would be this moment that we would know that He is opening a door for us and leading us into something that we thought we would never be able to afford, and we're still not 100% sure, but we are walking by faith. It's because He's the God of all the detail. And His promise is sure. So when He says something, it's going to happen. Yeah. And Stephen's unfolding this in such a way that we get to see this God of the impossible, who's promising things about descendants when Abraham's childless, because His promise is beyond the realm of possibility. And He's saying to these religious, can we not just stop boxing God into your precious little structures and boxes that you've made? He's far bigger than that. Yeah. He's a God of grace and He's a God of promise. And He does it through these devoted people. So Abraham's there, and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and now He's on to Moses. And He speaks about Moses in verse 22. He's educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. So Moses senses the calling of God on his life. I'm a rescuer. God's made me to be a rescuer. So he goes and visits the Israelites. He kills an Egyptian to try and protect them. Then he tries to mediate between two Israelites. They're like, hey, who made you? Like, what's going on? We don't know you. And he realizes, okay, they saw that I killed an Egyptian. This could be bad for me, and off to Midian. So there's a call on our lives, and we need to trust that God shows us what that calling is. But we can't miss God's timing. We can't get ahead of it, because God prepares us, right? So when you feel like there's a sense of what God has put on you, you got to know that if it's not happening now, He's just preparing you. Verse 29, when Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. So Stephen talks about 40 years 3 times. And basically what he's saying is Moses' life was made up of 3 categories, 3 kind of seasons, and they were all 3 40 years long. So he was 40 years in the palace, being shaped and educated as a prince. And then he was 40 years in isolation in Midian, shepherding sheep. And then this moment of the burning bush takes place, and it translates to 40 years in the wilderness, where he actually lives in the calling of being a rescuer, a deliverer as God had intended for his life, and he's shepherding humans. See, God knew he needed to shepherd sheep before shepherding humans, because we are like sheep. He needed to know that sometimes you've got to pick a sheep up and carry it back, and what does it mean to try and get sheep to all of that preparation time. Commentators mentioned it like this: Moses spent 40 years, these first 40 years, thinking he was a somebody. I'm a prince in the palace. Then he spent the next 40 years realizing he's a nobody, stuck in Midian. But his last 40 years was him discovering what God can do with a nobody. You see, like, God's overarching rule and reign over things, and how he brings his promises to bear, and through people who have seasons of being prepared and shaped, and then these monumental moments of a burning bush. See, we just want the monumental moments. Who wants to sign up for 40 years of shaping? No takers. Who's keen for a burning bush experience? Yeah. See, we like that. But God knows when the burning bush needs to happen. He knows when he must show himself in a way and release us into something more or different. Sometimes we just need 40 years. I'm hoping this is encouraging. 40 years of shaping, 40 years of preparation. And in Moses' case, 80, 40. Okay, now release. So this monumental moment happens with the burning bush. God says to him, take off your sandals. In verse 33, the place where you are standing is holy ground. Where was he standing? In Midian. Nowhere near the temple. Nowhere near Jerusalem. So God meets Abraham in Mesopotamia, he meets Joseph in Egypt, and he meets Moses in Midian. So the religious leaders are saying, you make your way to God by going to the temple. Stephen's saying, no, God makes his way to you by going to your trenches. Wherever you are, he'll meet you there. Because he's the God of grace and he's a God of promise. He's also a God of love. Verse 34, I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning, and I have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. The account in Exodus 3 that Stephen's actually referring to says one extra thing. It says, I've seen the misery of my people. I've heard their cries. I am concerned. I have come down. See, when we get to know this God of glory who sees, who hears, who is moved, and who acts. Maybe that's something that you just need to hear this morning. Where you find yourself in a place where you're taking shots, you're not quite sure of things, and you need the settling reality, the knowledge of the fact that God is a God of steadfast love who sees you. He sees you. He sees your misery. He's heard your cry. He's deeply moved. And he will come down. In fact, he has come down. Stephen then continues to talk about the fact that he led them out of Egypt. He did wonders and miraculous signs in Egypt at the Red Sea, and for 40 years, there's the last 40 years in the desert. This is that Moses who told the Israelites, God will send you a prophet like me from your own people. So they're like, hey, stop talking about Moses and the way you're speaking about Moses. Stephen's saying, no, much respect for Moses. But can I tell you about a greater Moses? Can I tell you about the greater Moses that Moses himself spoke about? Who said there is one coming. He prophesied. You're missing it if you're just going to focus on Moses. Because Moses spoke about a deliverer. And you know, Jesus is the captain of our salvation. He's the one that brings us out of Egypt. You know that song, No Longer Slaves? We've been liberated. We're no longer in bondage. We're no longer in a place of darkness. And then we get to walk with God. And sometimes it feels like it's a wilderness. But you know what? God shapes and He moves and He gives us who He is so we know how to live in response to Him. And then there's promised land lying ahead. So that whole picture that Stephen's talking about is a picture of salvation. Coming out of Egypt was an event. 40 days, but it was an event. Being in the wilderness was 40 years. The promised land was for generations. And coming out of Egypt was God taking His people out of Egypt, but the time in the wilderness was to take Egypt out of them and then give them a promised land, to walk into the reality of what God has as an inheritance. And that's the same salvation that Jesus gives us as the greater Moses, the one who delivers us from Egypt. That Passover lamb, the blood that was applied to the doorposts, that we get to apply to the doorposts of our hearts, knowing that He's our deliverer, knowing that He's the one who saves. We come out of that place of darkness. He meets us there, but He takes us out of it. We get to walk with Him. And we get to walk with Him in a way that we are conscious of the fact that there is a promise of inheritance, a promise of reward that is lying ahead. That we're not going to lay claim to while we're in this world. If He bestows some of that on us now already, great. But we live for that life. And we get to because He loves us. He loves us in a way where He would see this is our situation. He would hear our cry. He's deeply moved because of His steadfast love. He would actually act, and He would not send Moses in the context of Egypt and the Israelites. He would send Jesus in the context of this world and humankind, and to bring us out of that bondage and bring us to a relationship where we can be called children of God. And it's all He's doing. Lastly, He's the God of eternity. You see, there was this move of God meeting His people in the tabernacle, and then there was like David saying, hey, I want to build a temple for you. You know, God didn't actually ask for a temple. Just because David said he was going to do it and because it actually happened and Solomon built it, didn't mean that's what God wanted. Sometimes He just lets things happen. But that very temple was the temple that was completely ruined, distracted, like just, I don't know, however many years after Jesus died. But you see, what God is about is like, I want to be with my people. And I want my people to experience my presence. That's what it's about. And I'm on the move. I'm happy to be in a tent because I'm actually not confined to the tent. That's just something visual for them. But then, like, people get their ideas and, like, let's build you a temple. You know, let's build a house. You know, a building that would, like, kind of equate to your grandeur. And then God's like, heaven is my throne. And the earth is my footstool. What kind of house would you build for me? Says the Lord. Or where will my resting place be? Has not my hands made all these things? You can't make anything for me. I make everything for you. And I meet you anywhere. I will find you where you're at because that's my heart for you. The presence of God can't be confined to a building, can't be confined to a place, can't be confined to a nationality. It's wherever His presence and His people are. You can't contain Him in structures and customs and traditions. And we can so easily read this story and think, oh, these religious leaders, what a bunch of losers. Be careful. Because they just boxed God in to the traditions and customs that suited them. That's still happening today. You know, we'll make of God whatever we want to make of God because it must suit us. It mustn't interfere with our lives. We just want to have a comfortable Christianity, a Christianity that doesn't place too many demands on me, just like everything works, just constant, flow of blessings. And then I want that customized, structured life because it'll make me feel better about myself. This is exactly what these leaders were on about. Like, don't mess with the Mosaic law. Don't mess with the temple. We've got things in place. Things are working great for us. The stuff that you're talking about now, this Jesus, we killed him because we didn't like what he said. Now you're talking about him as if he's still alive. We're not liking this because it's cutting against what we've created. They took the law of God and they added all their traditions. They added all their customs. And they got themselves to a point where they felt like they were living this good life, this perfect life, and living in the presence of God, but they'd completely missed it. See, the presence of God is eternal, and the purpose of God is eternal. And he always works for our eternal good. Because we have an ultimate redemption. And Stephen didn't live for the temporal. He lived for the eternal. He looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God. When you look up, you got to tilt your head. Your neck's got to do that. And when you look up and you see the glory of God, because you're seeing the God of grace, the God of promise, the God of love, the God of eternity, this one who works salvation for my good and for my eternal blessing that I get to live in. When I look up, when I tilt my head up and I see that, then not only does my neck move in a way where I can look up, but actually I can look down in a way where I'm reverent before him and I can bow my head in humble submission and surrender and worship because of who he is. See, there's a reason why Stephen says in verse 51, you stiff-necked people. See, what he's actually saying is you don't have an ability to look up, which means you don't have an ability to bow down. You stiff-neck. When your neck's like this and you can't do stiff-necked because you're hard of hearing and you're hard of heart and you're just holding on to what makes you comfortable and what you think is right. And they had taken the temple and they had taken the law and they had morphed it into something that suits them. There's a word for it. It's called self-righteousness. And they didn't realize that Jesus, the righteous one, was actually the fulfillment of the temple and he was the fulfillment of the law. And when we put our faith in him, we are in him, so his fulfillment becomes our fulfillment. Can we live differently in the presence of God, knowing that he's a God of grace, a God of promise, a God of love, and a God of eternity?